I'm going to start this episode a little differently today. This episode represents my opinions as Charles Turtz and is presented solely as my views. As I've said, I am not a healthcare or mental health care professional and am not licensed to give medical advice. Nothing in this episode should be relied upon to diagnose, prevent, or treat any mental health or medical conditions. If there's something in this episode that resonates, you should consult a physician or other licensed and qualified health or mental health care professional to discuss all matters relating to your physical and mental health. For more information, please see our privacy policy at TURTZED.com/privacy. The second part of my coming out story is hard for me to start because I know what is to come, and this episode will go deeper and be more difficult. I heard from you how part 1 resonated and the impact it had on you. There was so much in part 1 that almost no one knew, and yet this episode has more. It has material that not only did I not tell people, but even in therapy, I could barely put it into words until more recently. It was too painful, and it felt like if I spoke about it, it would become real and something I would have to deal with head on. And I'm so thankful that I finally did. This episode of Turtz discusses depression, and I want to put that out there right up front because for me there were points in my life when just hearing the word depression would trigger me. It's important for me to share this episode because I am in a good place now, and I hope by sharing my full journey authentically, it may be helpful to hear an important message. We can get through these moments in our lives and get to a better place. So let's get into it. I've struggled to feel emotions since I was a kid. I spent most of the past 35 years ignoring my own feelings and trying to figure out what everyone else was thinking and feeling by their facial expression, their tone, their body language, and what they were not saying. For the last few years, I've been working in therapy to better connect to and understand the emotions that I'm feeling in the moment rather than looking back, because for so long I was so disconnected from all of them, I felt like a computer. In the last episode, I took you back to a time where I felt carefree at 5 years old. It isn't to say that I didn't experience joy after that time, but the waters became muddied. In the early part of my life, I experienced 2 main emotions, sadness and fear, which began the intense fight or flight instincts that became ingrained in my DNA. As I grew up, I wanted to be prepared for anything. I never wanted to sit with my back to an open space where I couldn't see exits and full visuals. My body language communicated the same thing, closed off and guarded. Much of the time with my arms crossed, sitting in a version of the fetal position without being in a ball on the floor, and always looking around, incapable of making eye contact for the fear that I would miss something. As a child and a teenager, I felt shame and embarrassment for having emotions or expressing needs, hopes, and preferences that didn't align with the views of my father. If I had just become a clone, it would have been easier. I felt that it was my fault that we were not presenting as the perfect Stepford family. I remember trying to portray the image of a kid from Westchester with the perfect family, the clothing, skiing on the weekends, but I struggled to communicate how I was feeling, and I felt like so much of the time my feelings were dismissed by others because I grew up with certain privileges. I started to think that I didn't have the right to my feelings, and that the privileges meant that I had no right to complain about feelings of being diminished, treated differently, being told who to be, and yelled at when I didn't act a certain way, to name a few. I even remember testing out a new therapist, and in our first 30 minutes, they stopped me mid-sentence, and for the first time, I was given permission to feel my feelings when the therapist said, "I'm going to stop you right there. You could have grown up with nothing, and if your father loved you the way you wanted, or any child would have wanted from a parent, you would have been better off." My jaw was on the floor, and I blurted out, "When can we book our next session, and how do I break up with my current therapist?" As I got older, I began to turn on myself, punishing myself emotionally when I didn't fit the mold of the little boy that I thought I had to live up to. I pushed myself to be the perfect version of myself, and a completely inauthentic one, I might add. And under this self-imposed pressure, I would explode when I couldn't meet the unrealistic standards I set for myself, for the fear that if I fell short of those standards, I would end up experiencing something worse than what I was already doing to myself. I felt strong emotions from a young age because I refused to believe that the way I was being treated at home was acceptable, and the more I stood up for myself, the more I was invalidated. Sadness and fear didn't disappear. They were just the first emotions that I became disassociated from, and then in came anger. I'm going to pause here for a definition. According to the National Institute of Health, disassociation is a process linked to lapses of attention, history of abuse or trauma, compromised emotional memory, and a disintegrated sense of self. It is theorized that disassociation stems from avoiding emotional information, especially negative emotion, to protect a fragile psyche. It is amazing what the body will do to survive because, as scary as being disassociated from myself has been at times, it is also the thing that I believe saved my life. Have you ever heard the story The Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen? It's the story of a vain emperor who hires two con men who make him a magical outfit, which was really nothing, and he wore the magical outfit in front of the whole city. Well, in this story, the townsfolk are looking at the emperor completely naked, and they all go along with it, and one child raises his hand and says, "But he hasn't got anything on." Have you ever been in a situation where you're looking around thinking, am I the only one seeing this? And everyone else is just going along with it? My father often yelled and screamed at me. I was terrified and afraid, and yet something inside me refused to be diminished, minimized, or erased. I felt like I was holding on by a thread, but I would not give in to what I knew to be wrong. If anyone says to you, because I said so, or I'm your father, you do as I say, take a moment to pause and question whether this has more to do with them than you. I want to pause my story for a second and speak generally about the parent-child relationship. You may have someone in your life whose behaviors include manipulation, deception, projection, anger towards others, and especially when questioned. All of these can be terrifying and make you question everything, and to make matters worse, those who are involved in the situation or witness it can often be gaslighted into staying silent for the fear of retribution and retaliation. Oftentimes, if you've experienced this type of narcissistic abuse, you may find yourself hiding and protecting the narcissist, especially when it is your parent. I mean, what human grows up without the biological instinct to want love from their mother or their father? Growing up, I was the child saying, something isn't right here. And most of the time, it was just me asking why. Why am I going to do that? Why do I have to do it that way? And as I said before, most of the answers I got were because I said so and because you do what your father says. Now, anyone who has met me knows that there is no way that I was going to accept that as an answer, especially when I could find a different and more efficient way to do something. Remember when we talked about gifts? Well, this became mine in business. I always ask myself why. Why are we doing it this way? How can we do it faster? How can we be more efficient? But as a child, I often experienced yelling and anger for questioning my father, and I thought that everyone saw the terrifying fury that would come out of him. And yet no adult stepped in those moments, and to me, it seemed like everyone else acted as if the emperor was speaking in plain monotone vernacular, and as a child, it made me feel like everyone else thought that this was acceptable behavior, and so I came to feel that there was something wrong with me. Once I had dissociated from the sadness and fear because no one was coming to help me or acknowledge my feelings, I became angry. I felt like this child constantly raising my hand saying the emperor isn't wearing any clothes. It felt like it was easier for me to live in anger and fight back against my father's pronouncements like, you can't wear flip-flops to dinner on the beach, which erupted into a full screaming match when I asked why, even though I was terrified and afraid. In my desperate attempt to set boundaries to try to protect myself, my anger grew. I pushed back yelling and screaming, which to an outsider, it might have seemed as if I was the problem and I was impossible. I remember overhearing my father tell my mom that he wanted to send me away because I couldn't be handled. There was even part of me that wanted this to happen so that I could escape. I even tried to will it into existence, loosely talking about getting sent away to a boarding school in the hopes that it might actually happen. There were so many nights I cried myself to sleep hoping I would get sent away or that my mom would leave my dad. As I look back at who I was and how much anger I presented to the world, I'm reminded of a conversation with my mom that I will never forget. I had been yelling angrily and she sat me down and said, if you don't learn to control your anger, you will become him. I fully understand why my mother told me that, and she was right. That would have been possible. She was trying to keep the family together, and she was living in her own fear, and at the time, she did what she thought would be best. Instead of stepping in, she told me to calm down and control my anger. I knew that in no way, shape, or form did I want to become him in my life, so we can add a third emotion that I disassociated from: anger. The problem was, in my day-to-day, I had shut down sadness and fear, and now anger, and I didn't have any other emotions to fall back on. That's when I turned to work for fulfillment and validation. I poured myself into my work and held on as if I was in the middle of the ocean and work was my life raft. Ironically, my first job was as a lifeguard after getting certified that summer. I was proud to have completed the certification, and I called my parents with excitement to tell them, only to be met with my father asking me, how could I have gotten lifeguard certified when I could barely doggy paddle? In my late teens and early 20s, I had no depth. What you saw was as far as it went. If I was with someone, I could feel their joy and enjoy the time, for the most part, and when that time ended, I went back to being disassociated from everything. Crying myself to sleep most nights, not understanding how I got to this place, and how disassociating from my feelings felt like the only way to not become my father, and keep those I cared about safe from me treating them the way that my father treated me. And this went on for years. By the time I turned 27, I was so disconnected from all my emotions, I felt like I was just walking around empty inside, hoping people would talk at me, tell me stories, tell me their problems so I could focus on everything but mine. My emotions and how I was feeling deep inside. If you asked me a question, I would look for the fastest way to answer so that I could turn around the conversation and bring it back to whomever I was speaking with. Once again, this turned into a gift for sales and understanding the customer's needs, but the toll it took on me became increasingly more and more dangerous. Even though I had told my parents a few years earlier, I fought internally with myself about coming out as gay until right after my 27th birthday. 2 days before that birthday, I was smoking with a friend and it just hit differently. Granted, I hadn't done much of it before, but this time I got stuck in a lucid dream for hours. The dream absolutely terrified me and would for years to come because I felt like I didn't have a grasp on reality and I was watching my worst fears play out. Now I can look back on the dream and not see it as a nightmare, but rather as a message of what my life would look like if I didn't start to make changes. Throughout the night, I felt like I was being punched in the stomach, and it was likely because it was the first time my body allowed me to feel anything in years. The dream ended with me standing on the edge of a building, looking down at the ground. I woke up and thought I was having a heart attack. I rushed myself to the hospital only to be placed in a room and told that I was having a panic attack. I went home, laid in bed, and barely ate the rest of the day, but I was determined to rest because my birthday was the next day. I woke up on October 18th, 2015, and had a strong feeling that something was off, and boy was I right. It turned out to be appendicitis. At the time, I was living with my brother and his now wife, and I told them that I wasn't feeling well and that my stomach hurt, and my brother very politely responded, "Charlie, we're going to go for a walk. It's probably just gas. We'll be back in an hour and go to brunch." We can laugh about it now, but inside I knew something was really wrong, and I went to the urgent care to double check. I have never been seen so quickly at an urgent care. Not only was the doctor pulled from another examination room, but they told me to go to the nearest emergency room because I was likely experiencing acute appendicitis. I was so disassociated at that point I couldn't even feel the physical pain, and 2 blocks later, I was back in the exact same room of the hospital where I had been the day before with the panic attack, being told that there was a serious possibility my appendix would burst, and they couldn't do surgery for at least 6 hours because I had had a protein shake before I got to the hospital. Now, if you know my mother, you can probably imagine the frantic call my brother received from her. She was yelling into the phone, "Do you understand how serious this is? He could die. You have to make sure that the doctor sees him immediately." To which my brother responded, "Mom, he's in a hospital. We will see you soon." At that point, I was still in communication with my father, and his response was not surprising. He told my mom as she was racing for the train to get into the city, "If you get to the hospital and he actually needs surgery, I will come in." I did need the emergency appendectomy, and I believe that surgery that day saved my life in more than one way. Not only did my appendix get removed, but this was the moment where I realized that something was seriously wrong, and it felt like there was a greater power saying, "Stop everything. You need to examine your life because you're making decisions that will affect the rest of your life, and you may choose to do something from which there's no coming back." That was the beginning of what was almost a decade of work to recover from my childhood trauma and the trauma I inflicted on myself consciously and subconsciously throughout my life. After having emergency surgery and spending my birthday in the hospital, I decided that it was time to make some changes, and the first one was coming out officially to those who I hadn't told yet. I spent years in fear and conflicted about coming out, and the stubborn side of me felt like I shouldn't need to do this because if you're straight, you don't have to make this announcement. But this was an important step in the process of starting to come out authentically to people that I loved. At that point, I decided to make my announcement. I didn't know who knew and who didn't know other than my parents and my brother because I had come out at one job but not the one before, or with one group of friends and not the other. Honestly, it was exhausting, and I had to keep everyone in their silo because I didn't know who would tell who if their paths crossed. I didn't even want to think about it, so like I do with every problem, I found the most efficient solution. I wrote a group email to the people I felt needed to know, and as I read it back, it was so devoid of emotion and basically sounded like a business press release, which I guessed was my authenticity at that time. Ironically, though, at the time I wrote it, I actually thought what I wrote was open and filled with feeling and emotion. But I did make one very heartfelt point in my coming out email. I wrote, "Saying I'm gay is worth it because omitting the truth with silence is no way to live and be happy with the loved ones in my life." Rereading the email broke my heart because I can feel the pain of 27-year-old Charlie and the desire to feel seen and understood as well as loved and accepted. Despite my inability to emote and connect in the email, after all, I had been disassociated from my emotions for years. Those who received the email went above and beyond to show me love that meant the world to me and helped me to keep going. And it still does. Their responses were all so beautiful, and although my grandparents are no longer with us, I wanted to share their response, because even in their late 80s, their acceptance and understanding of me was well beyond their and many other generations. What a beautiful statement of your coming out. We are very proud of you for having the strength and determination to write that statement to us. You have always been able to find the right path for yourself, and opening up to us about being gay makes us love and respect you more than ever. You must know that we will always respect your choices in life, and that our hopes and desires for you are that you will always be happy. Our deep love for you has been and always will be boundless. I'm not sure I ever properly thanked them and everyone else. And what kills me is that in challenging moments, we can deprive ourselves of connected experience with the ones we love, and for that, I'm deeply sorry, because if the tables were turned, I would have wanted to shower them with love and support. It's easy to say if I knew back then what I know now, I would have done things differently. However, this is part of my journey, and I wouldn't change it. As my brother often paraphrases Maya Angelou by saying that doesn't mean when we know better, we can't do better. I've learned so much from so many incredible professionals for whom I'm very thankful for. And I believe I'm ready to truly come out, and not as gay, yes, everyone knows that. But for me, it means something different now. I'm coming out as my authentic self, because regardless of how you view telling people you're gay, coming out to me means showing up each and every day as you, to the best of your ability, because one of the few things that we have control over in our life is showing up authentically to the best of our ability. And it's so much easier to live that way. In part one of my coming out story, I spoke about laying on the floor of the bathroom, praying that I would be able to make it through the night. I felt like my whole world was crumbling, and I didn't know how to handle it, even though I knew I was in trouble. I called my mom at 7 a.m. on the dot and told her I couldn't make it to graduation, which was less than 4 weeks away. To understand her reaction, you need to know that for the 4 previous years, I worked 40 to 60 hours per week. I finished my undergraduate degree in 3 years and figured out how to make my 4th year count by completing college and my MBA program in a total of 4 years. I thought I could simply tell my mom I was exhausted and needed a break and I wanted to come home. But at the time, I was actually afraid to be alone, and I thought that I was hiding how depressed I was. After episode 3 was released, and nearly 15 years after those events around my graduation, my mom and I had a very emotional conversation in which she told me how alarmed and scared she actually became during that call, and that she thought she was going to lose me that day. She told me that immediately she called to her twin brother to ask him if he would speak with me as my uncle, not as a therapist, because she was afraid that after we hung up the phone that I might not make it home. And 15 years ago, I was afraid that I wouldn't make it home either. Sadly, the fear she had was heightened because her own uncle had taken his own life about a year before I was born. I remember getting home and going to my uncle's house and speaking with him for over 3 hours, telling him everything like a floodgate had burst. I don't know what made me do this or how I gained the courage to do this after hiding for almost my entire life. But he listened and gave me a semblance of hope that I could continue with life. I left the conversation feeling loved and hopeful and began therapy the next week. Obviously, my uncle couldn't be my therapist, and I'm so thankful for him and the time he set aside for me that night. When I found out my mom knew how distressed I was, my stomach dropped. I couldn't understand how she could have let me go back to school. That's the thing. We often don't know why people do the things they do. We often don't know what others are thinking, often attribute feelings that are based on inaccurate conclusions we make about ourselves. In this case, no one cared. I struggled to understand and was afraid of the answer, but I asked her anyway. If you were afraid of the mental state that I was in, why did you let me go back to school? Why didn't you say something? Her answer was simple. Charlie, I was so terrified I was going to lose you, and I didn't know what to do. And in that moment, calling my brother was the only path I could see to keep you safe. He called me after he spoke with you, and although he didn't tell me anything about your conversation, he felt like you could go back to school that day and that you were going to start therapy. I had to trust him because I was afraid that if I said or did anything, that it might upset the balance he had created, and I couldn't live with the possibility of what could happen. I think it's important to understand that these moments of desperation are not as hidden as we think they are. People who love us know they can intuit where we are, and it's one of the hardest positions for someone to be in because there's no playbook to have that conversation. There are so many factors, and everyone's different. I want to open a dialogue because I wish I knew back then what I feel today, which is that I had way more support and love in my life than I realized. It frightens me and still gives me anxiety that I was so convinced that no one cared, no one loved me, and no one believed me. And inside, I felt like there was no point in saying anything to anyone because I was often told that isn't how you feel, or it could be worse. My mom and I have struggled to communicate at times over the years, and it has caused frustration on both sides, but there's always love. There are so many examples of my mom providing me unconditional love, but today, while I go to therapy to better understand myself and find my authenticity, she's putting in the work too. Together, we are working on the way we communicate and shifting to a healthier relationship filled with mutual understanding. I know that it can't be easy for her because it hasn't been easy for me, but the love I have for her taking the harder road and putting in the work and having the difficult conversations in order to become closer is more than I could have ever asked for or imagined. Although in the past I tried to wear a mask of joy and happiness, I have come to understand that I wasn't fooling anyone. I was so disassociated from physically or mentally feeling anything. I refused to let myself believe I could have suicidal thoughts because if I acknowledged it, it would become a reality that I would have to deal with, and I didn't think that I was strong enough to handle that yet. I lived my life afraid to stand on the subway tracks on my way to work, putting myself as far away from the tracks as possible until the train was safely stopped at the station. I wouldn't stand on street corners until the light was ready for me to cross, and I would avoid any media, TV, movies, shows, music that had to do with depression. By staying away from these things, I avoided the feelings of despair and tried to keep myself as safe as I could because I never knew what was going to trigger me. I spent so much of my late teens, 20s, and early 30s trying to change everything about me and my life. I moved, I became friends with different people, I cut my hair differently, I got tattoos, I got piercings, I tried drugs, but the one thing I didn't try was looking inward. It was too painful, and I eventually reached the end of my rope. I was walking home one afternoon, and I felt like I couldn't even control my own mind and body. I tried to get myself to stop on a street corner, and my legs kept moving. I told myself to grab onto a fence, but my arm stayed by my side. I told myself to stop and talk with the doorman, but my lips were sealed shut. As I entered my apartment afraid of what might happen next, I was able to gain the smallest amount of control and called my therapist, and when they didn't answer, I texted, "It's an emergency." And immediately I received a text that said, "I will call you in 15 minutes. I felt like I could take a breath again. I also knew I had a major problem. I felt desperate and alone, but something inside me fought the urge to make a decision that I would not have been able to come back from. I couldn't let those feelings become the end of my story." In recording this podcast and sharing these stories for the first time publicly, I had to take a minute just now because, as you could hear, I was very emotional and I wanted to make sure that what I say next is incredibly clear. I am so thankful that I can not only look back and reflect, but also share these parts of my story because I no longer feel alone. I'm grateful for the people in my life that have supported me even when I couldn't see or take in their support. I want to continue opening dialogue with people in my life and with my listeners because as we reflect together on the podcast topics, we can build stronger connections with each other and those in our lives. I want to summarize a few things I hope that those listening will take away from this episode. First, depression can feel like it fully takes over your mind and it can convince you of things that are not reality and are absolutely terrifying. Each person's struggle is unique, and there's no single formula to approach someone who is struggling. But I know that there are many mental health professionals that can help you navigate how to have that conversation. Second, sometimes those who put on the bravest face, seem the most put together, and are helping others can often be the ones struggling in silence. And if you're able to create a safe space for open dialogue, it can provide small and crucial details that might help you to understand how a person is suffering. Third, there are many different resources, modalities, and professionals that can help you build a village of support to work through the dark places and help find a better understanding of self. And finally, don't assume that you know what people are thinking or what motivates them. Come from a place of curiosity and with kindness, ask a question to start an honest conversation. As I've said, my goal with this podcast is to continue to share my stories, the stories of others, as well as bring on professionals to share their practices. I want to share the things that I've learned which have helped me, and I want to continue to create space for open and honest conversations to help those struggling. I'm still learning. I'm still exploring myself. I'm continuing to try new modalities, and each day I try to live a little more authentically, and I try to provide myself a little grace when I fuck up, to create space to apologize and build a stronger relationship with those that are willing to be there in the hard times with mutual love and respect. If you've been enjoying the podcast so far, we are just getting started. There's so much more to come, and I want to hear from you. I would love to hear what topics you want to talk about. So head over to turtz.com/the-podcast and use the form at the bottom of the page to get the topics flowing. Many people have asked how they can support me in this journey, and I'm so appreciative. There are a few things you can do, and they don't include writing down the name of my podcast to give it to the Best Buy sales associate, although I did appreciate the promotion, Mom. You can head over to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and rate the podcast, as well as provide a review if you're so inclined. You can follow the podcast on your favorite platform so that you know when the next episode drops, and you can share it with friends or family by hitting the share button on either platform, and that works on socials too. Thank you for the opportunity to open up and for the kindness along the way. I wanted to share these stories many times for the first time so that you will have context for the next phase of the podcast. I'm so excited to dive in with our first interview next week, which will focus on fitness, and we will have a very special guest, Juicy Rob and his sick fitness.